Actually 12:02, so we will get started with our introductions and get this lunch and learn on the road, so to speak. So today, our lunch and learn, we have presenters from SITLA, Troy Harold and Wes Adams. Troy is the Deputy Assistant Director, and Wes is the Assistant Director for Oil and Gas for SITLA. I will let them talk more about what exactly that means, because I honestly don't know a lot about what SITLA does, so I'm eager to hear what you guys have to talk to us about today. So I will turn it over to you, Troy.
Great, thank you, Bailey. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity here to present to the group. If it's all right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started. We get this set up here. So again, we appreciate your time. Troy Harold. I'm the Deputy Assistant Director over Renewable Energy Projects here with the School Trust Lands Administration. My counterpart, Wes, is joining us, and I'll let him introduce himself a little further. I wanted to take a few minutes and go through and give everyone a SITLA 101. We sometimes get a lot of questions about what SITLA is, what we do, etc. I'll try and breeze through that a little bit. I think both Wes and I would like to make this interactive as much as possible. So we'll try and breeze through the relevant information, and then maybe leave a lot of room for questions towards the end of our presentation, towards the end of our 45 minutes here. So SITLA is a entity that, well, in 1894, when Utah came into the state, or when Utah came in as a state, Congress granted lands to Utah to establish basically endowments, permanent endowments for the beneficiaries that we as an agency take care of. There are 12 beneficiaries. Largely it's the public education system, K through 12. But you can see there's other beneficiaries that we also work to develop our properties for endowments for. The higher education institutions in the state, special education, and other public institutions, public buildings, Utah hospitals, reservoirs, etc. So how that was developed was, if you're familiar with surveying terms, and hopefully a lot of folks in the energy department are, a township is basically a area of land that is 6 miles by 6 miles. It's developed into 36 sections. Each one of those sections is generally 1 mile across. Utah and our state constitution was granted to the trust and to the school kids of Utah sections 2, 16, 32, and 36. And that's actually where our logo comes from. You can see that in our logo is where these sections are. So those sections were granted to the school trust, to our beneficiaries. And when the state came in, we have to remember we were an very much an agrarian society. So the intent was that uses on these lands would go to benefit the school trust. It was agricultural based, some mining, but that was essentially the forethought of at statehood, was that those revenues would go into a permanent endowment that would then help support the schools. So in '94, the previous entity to SITLA, which was basically through the State Department of Natural Resources, was managing the lands. And I wasn't around at the time, but the information I understand is that the beneficiaries at the time had some concerns about the way the lands were being managed. They were being managed more as if they were state lands and not necessarily in the benefit of the beneficiaries. So they discussed that with the legislature. There was some lawsuits being threatened back and forth, and the Utah legislature created SITLA as a compromise. And so that's how our agency became developed in 1994. We managed the 3.4 plus or minus million acres of surface and mineral estate across the state. You can see our checkerboard pattern here. We are a quasi-independent state entity. We have a 7-member board that we answer to. We are fully self-funded, and we receive the revenues that we receive off of the land are from many different resources, but basically through energy development, real estate development, surface activities such as agricultural and grazing leasing and telecommunications leasing, and then also mining. And I'm not sure why Wes isn't listed here, but our oil and gas group as well. So.
And Troy, I would just add to that we actually have 4.5 million surface acres, and 4.5 million surface acres and 3.5 million mineral acres. So we have a little bit more of a land position there than we indicated. But yeah, we do make a lot of the revenue from oil and gas, which is in the energy realm.
So what does it mean for SITLA to be a trust management agency? Under Utah Supreme Court law, we have a fiduciary responsibility as both staff and as an agency to our beneficiaries. That basically means we have an undivided loyalty. The beneficiaries of our lands do not include other governmental institutions, the public at large, or even the general welfare of the state. We have an undivided loyalty to basically the School of Kids of Utah and our other beneficiaries. And so that's always at the forefront of every decision we make as an agency and as staff. Well, the administration, we have 80 employees across the state. A large portion of those are in Salt Lake. We also have field offices in Richfield, Moab, St. George, Price, and Vernal. As I mentioned, we are fully self-funded. We don't take any public tax dollars. Our job is to manage the land and to manage the resource. We have a sister entity called SITFO, the School and Institutional Trust Fund Office. They manage the fund. That's their job. And they manage the investment portfolio and where that fund's at. As I mentioned, our allegiance is to the beneficiaries, but we do try and work with communities. So different community groups that have concerns, whether if it's from a real estate development project, any other type of development that's happening on our lands, we try and take care of that. And we do have the 5 business group, as I've mentioned. And these are the types of revenues and where those revenues come from in our business groups. Our oil and gas group, our mining group, our real estate development, which our real estate development portfolio is mostly active in the St. George community. If you're familiar with St. George at all, we have projects called Desert Color, Sienna Hills, Coral Canyon, et cetera. Basically all the outskirts of St. George proper development that is happening is mostly happening on trust lands. We have surface and agricultural leasing that takes place across the state, telecommunications sites, et cetera, and renewable energy projects. As a state lands management entity, some of our concerns we run into is we also still try and manage the land as best we can. Part of that is through conservation. And we're not in the business of conservation, but that doesn't mean we don't cooperate with that. We have cultural resource projects we work on. One of my favorite stories is we try and exchange out of or trade out of those properties. I'm not sure that's a picture of Corona Arch, but I think it is. Corona Arch was actually on SITLA lands, and through the recreation exchange we completed, we're actually able to exchange out of that property and get properties that were more revenue producing for the trust.
That is Corona Arch.
Yeah. So building the permanent fund over SITLA's since 94 until now, just over 25 years, or close to 25 years now. We have contributed over 2.036 billion to the fund since 1994. And in fiscal year 20, I should have updated this, we generated 75.25 million. I think last year we generated a little over 80 million, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken. But you can see the revenues over the years. A lot of that is through our oil and gas group and our real estate development group as well has been the primary input into that fund. The fund balance, as you can see, has gone from where it was literally $50 million, $50 to $60 million at 94. So from statehood up until the mid 90s, it was only about $50 million. And now we're approaching $3 billion in the fund. the K through 12 school system is becoming increasingly funded by SITLA, and from what we hear, feedback from the community councils, it's some of their some of the funds they enjoy using the most because it's the most flexible. It allows the schools to have money that can be set aside and used in a way that each individual school needs. Some schools may need a new computer lab. Some schools may need additional tutoring. Some schools may need other ESL language courses. All those funds that provide for those things are generally coming from SITLA and from the community councils. The annual distribution, again, is also accelerating and becoming more of an important part to their distribution. Last year, in fiscal year 20, we released over 88.8 million to the schools. And again, in 21, I released a little bit more than that, I believe. And 22, we expect to do the same. And it'll continue to grow. So with that brief overview, I want to talk a little bit about the stuff that this group is more concerned about, the renewable energy and oil and gas group. So I came from a real estate development background, and the agency up until just last year, I was just recently appointed to this position in spring of 21. So I've been in the position about 7 months now. The renewable energy projects on our lands were being managed by 3 to 4 different individuals within the agency. It was fairly sporadic. There wasn't a cohesive approach to how we would be approaching renewable energy projects. And so my position was created, and I was fortunate enough to be moved into that position. The advantages of that is it's showing to the renewable energy community that SITLA is very interested in renewable energy projects, and we're interested in receiving these projects on our lands as not only a help to our communities, but additionally a source of revenue for the school kids. I am responsible for, my group's responsible for all of our solar leasing, all of our wind, geothermal, and particularly our assets at the IPP block. This is a picture of actually some of our projects that we have in the Milford Flats area. So of our photovoltaic solar projects, we have about 30,000 acres leased as of today. We have 3 operational projects. That's only accounting for about 51 megawatts, but we have 3 that are under construction this year, and hopefully you're aware of some of those. The Electron Solar Project, the Horseshoe Solar Project, and the Castle Solar Project. Electron and Horseshoe are both here adjacent to in Twilla County, adjacent to the Great Salt Lake. Castle is over by Huntington. But those 3 projects will account for 200 megawatts of new photovoltaic solar that'll be coming online on SITLA's lands here just in the next year. We also have 16 current leases that are in pre-development. They're working on their large generator interconnection agreements at various stages, and a couple of those are actually doing finalization of their power purchase agreements. So we expect to see another 200 or so megawatts coming online within year 22. So we're excited about that. And we've additionally have 7 now new applications pending for additional leases on our land. So it's becoming more of an interest to the photovoltaic solar community, and we're excited to see these projects moving forward. We have 2 wind projects. They are both in the Milford Flats area, and they exist. It's the Utah Wind Project. If you're familiar with it, as you can see in this aerial, there is the wind corridor that comes through that area, and underneath those windmills, they actually have hog farms and methane. And some of those are not on our lands, but we wouldn't mind entertaining some of those uses as well. We also in this area, and it doesn't show up very well on the lease map, but we have geothermal assets. There are 2 operating geothermal assets, and I'm putting out approximately 30 megawatts of geothermal energy on our lands in the same Milford Flats area. And those are in combination with the Forge project, which hopefully the group is familiar with. So the Forge project is doing more of a research station on how to extract additional geothermal energy from basically the hot rocks and not necessarily the steam type. So our IPP block is one of our key assets that the trust is looking at in the near-term future. It is a 20,000 acre block. If you're not familiar with it, it is just north of Delta. It is a trust-owned surface and mineral estate. A Intermountain Power Plant is central to the block. It's basically that donut hole that you see in the middle of this map here. The property is unique in that it's actually fortuitous. It sits on a large geologic salt dome. The salt dome is about 1 mile deep and 2 miles across, and the top of that salt dome is approximately 3/4 miles down. Magnum Holdings, I consider them our anchor lessee. They have been researching and working on that salt dome for many years, and looking to do petroleum storage on that, natural gas storage. Most recently, they've been moving into a partnership with Mitsubishi and Chevron, the ACES One partnership, to generate and store hydrogen. We're excited about that and the opportunities that that presents. But the idea would be, as the Intermountain Power Plant changes over from the existing coal plant to its new natural gas plant, the turbines that are being put into that natural gas plant will be able to burn natural gas and hydrogen. They're anticipating a start date in 2025 and will be a 70%, 30% mix, 70% natural gas, 30% hydrogen, with the hope that that mix can move more and more to 100% renewable by 2045. We also anticipate there will be a large amount of traditional development that might happen around that facility in the energy sector, both typical site development and businesses that could support this large energy cluster. And we've also had over 10,000 acres of property on the block and surrounding block that we're looking to potentially exchange into from the BLM. That will allow for an additional 1,000 megawatts of potential electricity generation through, again, photovoltaic solar. And that would help with the creation of the green hydrogen. The property is additionally established as a phase 1 EDCU megasite, so we're pretty proud of the block as a whole. The renewable energy is obviously, it's a new sector for the trust, quasi-new. Our first lease that we signed was in 2008, 2009, and that was for a geothermal project and for the wind projects. And as you can see, that revenue flattened out about 300,000 a year, all the way up to 2016, 2017. As soon as we started seeing solar come online, you can see where this graph just grows exponentially for the revenue for the trust. And although it's a small number, revenues grow exponentially with small numbers, thankfully. You can see here in between 2021, when we start adding the hydrogen mix for the Magnum Mitsubishi project, I think the trust expects that the revenues we receive from renewables will again be growing exponentially for at least the next couple of years. And we see it certainly not a replacement to any revenue being lost from our other groups, because Wes can speak to his group, they're still doing fantastic. But certainly an added resource for the school kids of Utah, and will help with any type of energy transition moving forward. So,
yeah, thank you, Troy.
You're welcome.
So,
you take
kind of with that perspective in mind, we are dealing with an energy transition right now, and so there's a lot of developments occurring that we're trying to figure out how to manage for each type of unique energy project in the future. But the traditional way of revenue development for oil and gas is what I want to speak about and give you guys a little bit more context on. So my name is Wes Adams. I'm the Assistant Director for Oil and Gas, and I've been involved here at SITLA for about 5.5 years. I'll do a brief introduction to our team, and we have a few landmen here, or excuse me, 3 primary functions. One is going to be land, the other is going to be geoscience, which is relatively new, and then field supervision is the third kind of stool, leg of the stool there. Lindsay Dick is a landman. She's been in industry for more than 10 years. She came here in March of this year. And then Tyler Wiseman is a recent graduate from the University of Utah, focused on GIS and geophysics. So he's doing a lot of our technical research. And then Dorothy Taylor follows up with a lease analyst and focuses on lease assignments. And that'll be kind of connected to even what Troy is doing on a lot of his leases and or what we're going to be doing in the future with the mining leases as well. So our vision eventually is to have a huge energy umbrella, and then delineate from there to have like an oil and gas function, a renewable function, a mining function. But all of these areas do overlap. I mean, we're going to require critical minerals for renewable development. We're going to require microgrids and petrochemicals to construct material. So realistically, I think we have an energy transition, but we also have like bridge fuels and an overall broader energy mix into the future, which will generate energy and materials. So with that, I'll go into Tyson Todd is our field operations lead. He's out of the Vernal office, and so he does a lot of the oversight for physical locations, maintaining compliance with divisional gas and mining, and overseeing like plugging and reclamation liability, so that we have our own independent boots on the ground and we don't have to fully rely on the regulators at hand. So next slide, Troy. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of context on what's happening, you know, in the oil and gas field. And I don't know if anybody knows, but most of our production is coming from the Uinta Basin, which is the northeast quadrant of the state, which is really comprised of Duchesne and Uinta counties. Historically, we've had a lot of vertical well producers out here. That was kind of Utah's MO, and that's been representing about 90% of our oil production and about 60% of our natural gas production. In 2015, the industry started to develop horizontal wells in Utah, kind of like they were doing in Texas and North Dakota. And that has created a lot of upside and future growth potential for Utah. But one of the problems we have is getting to outside markets. So we're kind of capped on 85,000 barrels a day at the local refineries, but there's a higher demand than that domestically and globally. So our goal here is to try to get a railroad built over Indian Canyon, which could double or triple production and achieve economies of scale within the horizontal well program. So that would be good for industry. That would be good for Utah at large on a tax revenue and SITLA's beneficiaries. But one of the things we have to overcome is kind of regulatory hurdles and getting things approved. And recently they did an EIS, an environmental impact statement led by the Surface and Transportation Board, which included 5 different federal agencies with jurisdiction, and PLIPCO took the lead for the state of Utah. So we have a future potential here. The railroad will cost about $1.2 billion to construct and maybe 3 years to build. And the STB issued a draft or maybe even a formal decision record on that EIS. And so environmentally, I think we're through the thick of it, but the next stage will be getting final investment, which will also include tribal participation because of the railroad crossing their land. So there's a lot of different moving parts, but the takeaway here is that SITLA, from these areas depicted in green being an oil basin and depicted in red being a gas basin, we've generated about $500 million to the trust from natural gas production and about $200 million from oil. And even though oil trades at a higher price, natural gas is still our bread and butter. But we've seen a large decline since 2012 on that front because of the economics of drilling in the Rockies and gas prices going below $2 an MCF. Next slide, Troy. So another field that's worth considering is called the Drunkard's Wash field, and I'll talk about that one first. The second is going to be the Covenant field. And Drunkard's Wash is in Carbon County. And that's a black and white photo on the upper right. And that's basically a coal bed methane field, a really shallow formation. It's called the Farron Formation. And it's been highly economic and monetized really well. It's a dry gas, so meaning we're not pulling out any type of liquids like NGLs from that production. So not a lot of processing, but significant amount of production. We've made more than 230 million just from this field alone. So it's really been a great asset for us. And we got it through the Grand Staircase exchange with the BLM in the 90s, in addition to a $50 million payout. So in other words, whenever we do a monument exchange, like what's being contemplated with Bears Ears, for example, all the end holdings that SITLA has are basically appropriate to exchange. And so we try to get out of a monument and into lands that are more conducive for development. That's getting harder and harder to do as we advance into the future. But in the past, you know, in the 90s, this was a great opportunity for SITLA, and we executed on that. And then as it relates to the Covenant field, that's a deeper sandstone production zone, which is called the Navajo Formation. And this is off of like a geologic concept called the Thrust Belt. And that's extending down from Wyoming effectively, but it's created a sweet spot trap for a lot of hydrocarbons. And initially, there was a thought for gas production, but what turned out to be the case was a massive oil reservoir. And that field's been producing since, I would say, early 2008. And SITLA has generated significant amount of revenue from only 40 acres of participation, equivalent to about $17 million. And in 2019, they actually delineated that field a little bit further and doubled our interest by drilling another well. And then in 2022, we expect 3 more wells to be drilled, which will increase our interest another 80 acres or 50%. So the takeaway there is that we could see revenue from this field of upwards of 30 to 45 million, just from a relatively small percentage of acreage. I mean, if you look at 40 acres out of the 4.5 million mineral acres that we manage, that's huge value. It's like hitting the bullseye on a dartboard. Next slide, Troy. So the other thing I'd like to talk about here is a little bit more about horizontal well complexity, in case those of you aren't familiar. Utah is relatively new to the game. I have some imagery that shows kind of all the interest right now the industry has. And so a lot of these lines that you're looking at are the trajectory of individual wellbores that would be planned on what they call 1,280 acre spacing unit. The thought is to get a stacked play, different horizons vertically, and drilling up to 32 wells in a 1280. So we're at the beginning of this kind of pilot program, but what industry has shown is that it is definitely viable, and it actually is going to necessitate the railway in order to achieve economies of scale, because in order for companies to come to Utah and deploy capital, they need to get a return on that capital, and the velocity on that return is not high enough when they're limited to producing 85,000 barrels a day at the local refinery. So what we're trying to do is get our product out to the refineries in the Gulf Coast and maybe even overseas, because of the Uinta wax, they call it. Our oil has a higher paraffin, a higher wax content, gives it a premium. It's a good blending agent and can be refined into many other products besides gasoline and distillates. So what we're seeing today is a little bit more activity with 6 to 8 rigs running in the Uinta Basin, largely fed by the higher price in oil. But at the same time, from SITLA's perspective as an agency, we don't have our typical checkerboard pattern that Troy alluded to earlier. We only have lands that we received in lieu of selections that the feds had already patented out, or lands that we inherited through foreclosure in the 1930s. So when we were a part of DNR, the agency actually issued mortgages to people, and people were homesteading out there in the basin. And unfortunately, the Depression caused people to lose their mortgages, and that actually went to the SITLA agency and has benefited us hugely. Otherwise, we would have no production in this horizontal activity at all. So with the next slide, Troy. Last thing I want to talk about is the Paradox Basin, which is a really complex basin in Utah. This is southeast Utah, covering San Juan and Grand counties. This is more of a sweet spot, not a resource play like we have in the Uinta Basin. There's been a lot of wildcatting or exploration over the decades, but not a lot of production. I mean, it's probably a 10%, accounting for 10% of our total production. But the one thing we have seen out here is a high success rate in what they call the King Creek unit. That field is probably has total production exceeding 7 million barrels of oil. SITLA is unitized into federal production. We, because of our stranded land ownership nature, it benefits us to pool with the federal lands that we're surrounded by. And we benefit from that greatly. So whenever there's production on federal land, it also brings SITLA into production. And we've made more than $9 million from a very small niche out here. And so that's worth noting, because we still have a lot of upside for exploration in the Paradox Basin, but we're seeing a lot of federal policies that are kind of limiting our ability to monetize our individual lands because of what I mentioned before on the federal units. We need cooperation from the federal government. We need pooling, we need efficiency, and we need to de-risk for industry. So we're kind of working through those growing pains when one administration is very supportive of federal lease development, and then another administration is not supportive of it. But there's another kind of peripheral activity going on in the Paradox Basin that I'm really excited about, and that's going to be helium. So for those of you who don't know, this is a critical mineral, and it's used in semiconductors, telemetry, computer manufacturing, cell phones, hospitals, MRIs. It has a high-tech application, and it trades at anywhere from $300 an MCF up to $1,000 an MCF. And if you compare that to natural gas, which is trading at $6 an MCF, it's a multitude higher. So we have a great opportunity to monetize this resource if we can have a discovery, and we're working on exploration right now. But we also need to have kind of ground level policies that help support helium as a critical mineral, more than just a party balloon kind of substance. So the next slide there, Troy. Just some financial highlights from the agency. I won't go through all of these, but I do want to identify a trend that we had a high in 2013 when oil prices were $120, $110 a barrel. We also had significant gas production, which we've declined from since then. So that's kind of our peak year. We've declined since. 2019 was fairly well with 35 million roughly. And then obviously the pandemic did hit home here for us as well, cutting our revenues by at least a third in the last 2 years. But there is kind of light at the end of the tunnel. I think our forecasts were way under what actually came in fiscal year 21, and fiscal year 22 is back on track to get to pre-pandemic levels. But this is kind of concurrent with inflation that's happening in the market too. So I have some concerns on that and whether or not we can sustain this. But historically speaking, natural gas has earned about 650 million to the trust, and oil has earned about 350 million. So we're talking about $1 billion in contribution from oil and gas development. We're excited about that. We think there's future potential on both of those fronts to continue and perpetuate, in addition to kind of the renewables and transition occurring in energy. And next slide, Troy. So other projects that we have in work, we're really proactive about business development here at Trust Lands. Our mandate is to basically generate highest and best use for our lands and our beneficiaries. And so we try to replicate industry. We're a quasi-agency with one foot in, one foot out. So we're basically in government and private sector at the same time. Although we do report to the governor at the end of the day. So oil exploration, we have a lot of that going on across the state. We have some LNG potential. I mentioned that we're declining on natural gas production in the Rockies, and that's true, but we also have an external market similar to what we have for crude oil. We just need to get out of this stranded situation that we're in. I think that we can export our natural gas production through the West Coast to Asian markets that are using coal for power generation. And so we joined ourselves into a study that researched that and did a full life cycle analysis to kind of compare full production scale in Utah, Rockies, natural gas, and this is going to be collective basins, including Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico. But our gas, when produced here, transported to the West Coast, liquefied, shipped, regasified, and used for power generation, can reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by 42 to 55% per unit of energy. And that's a high incentive in a climate change world when we're talking about achieving these targets and net zero emissions. This is a great opportunity to drill down on, and it does not yet consider carbon capture, which is another opportunity that we're going to have moving into the future. I think industry is very interested in Utah. We have deep saline aquifers capable of storing carbon, and if we can get EPA to grant primacy to the state of Utah, that will make things more efficient for us. But I suspect in the future we will have more carbon capture storage projects on the horizon, similar to what Troy was talking about with the other renewables that are kind of getting a lot of activity. And the administration in Washington is funding a lot of these projects with DOE grants, so they're really throwing everything they have at decarbonizing, and we're trying to get out in front of that as much as we can. And I think that's my last slide. Troy has a window that he wants me to share with you all. It's going to be on our GIS mapping. So if you guys have some time, I would suggest you visit our website to get familiar with things that we're doing, lands that are available for leasing, and I'll pull up this map so you can kind of see what we're doing. As we start to drill down, we have our base map, our plat map, which shows all the ownership in Utah. Yellow is federal, blue is SITLA, this kind of orange is tribal. We've got national parks, U.S. Forest Service, everything mapped out, and the Bears Ears National Monument is depicted in purple here. You can see how we still have our blue checkerboard pattern. Those are in holdings, and we may be negotiating exchange on those. That is all very early on in the stages of announcement. And then at the top here, you're going to have surface layers for our surface group. Troy talked about his renewable leases, and those are actually depicted here on a layer independently. So when we turn those on, you can start to break things out with energy storage, solar, wind, etc. And if you want more information on that, you can zoom into each contract and kind of get further details. And then on the top, we have a layer for oil and gas. That's where I predominantly live. And then we also have other minerals, which is the hard minerals, the mining. I would say that, you know, carbonates and lithium are going to be really prevalent in the future with renewables. And then we get into the other layers that we have for real estate development, etc. So you can come to this webpage. You can suggest it to people that you're around as a good tool for getting to know trust lands a little bit more. And with that, I'll end my presentation and just see if you have any questions.
Hey, Wes, turn on your oil and gas layer just so someone can see the difference between the number of leases I manage renewables versus the number of leases your group manages.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have quite a bit going on as I turn on all the oil and gas active lease layers. You can see how many active contracts we have. There's 1,300 currently. Most of these are brought into production. So out of the 4.5 million mineral acres that we manage, I would say no more than 400,000 are being monetized. So we're doing a pretty good job with what we have. The geology will always dictate. So unfortunately, we can't replicate this throughout the state, but we're lucky to have what we have. But with helium coming around, this opens the door for new opportunity and carbon capture as well. So.
With that, I guess we'd open up to any questions. Unless you want to stop sharing rest. There we go.
I have a question really quick. So I think for the last, I mean, at least for the 2020 census, Utah was one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing state. How does SITLA, do you guys anticipate any problems keeping up with growth? I mean, I'm assuming with more growth will come more children that will need schools, but I mean, it seems like you guys have a lot of revenue streams coming in, so.
You know, the answer, and I'll go first, Troy, and then you can follow up. We do think about that a lot, you know, with the trajectory of oil and gas revenues typically trending downward. And there is an opportunity to reverse that trend with LNG exports. There's a viable option there. There's a viable option with additional crude oil that's needed globally for some time. I mean, if we shut down oil development in Utah but demand it from foreign producers, then we're no better off. And so I think that's really where we need to make sure that the energy transition will have market penetration and displace oil and gas as it will, but there's also going to be a demand for it, albeit while these things occur. So at the same time, our trust is up to $3 billion. And so the way the distributions are organized is that we kind of cap those distributions at 4% so that we can sustain market volatility. And we've seen year over year our distributions to public schools increase, and I think we're getting close to 100 million. So right now we're doing a pretty good job of keeping pace with production or with the population growth in Utah. We're giving more to the schools as the population grows. So the model is working pretty well with CFO.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is, you know, people ask me and Wes, I think when Wes and I go to energy conferences together or any kind of economic summit, or just last Friday, we were at the Business Economic Summit for Utah Business. We had a gentleman come up and talk to both of us, and you know, he said it's kind of odd to see someone who's over renewables be sitting there working with someone who's over oil and gas. I see it as just the exact opposite. As we've said, the world is changing. There is going to be an energy transition, but you will never, in my mind, get rid of or not have a need for the oil and gas industry. Just from the byproducts and everything else that happens in the oil and gas industry. The advantage of merging renewables with oil and gas is you get the benefits of both. Renewables have great advantages, but also renewables have some drawbacks too. And you know, so merging the two is I think the future and where we need to go with any kind of transition. It's not, you can't shut the switch off and turn the switch on the other one. It just doesn't work that way.
That's great. Cam, you have a question?
Yeah, I had a quick question about the leases that you were just talking about, Wes. With the number of leases that are active, is that doesn't necessarily mean each lease is being executed. Is that correct? Like it's not actively being mined, but it's been purchased and someone has it on holding?
Yeah, that's correct, Cameron. So most of the leases that we have are going to, I would say 2/3 are probably in production, and they're actually held in operation. I would say maybe no more than 1/3 are what we would call primary term lease, where the operator is either trying to explore or bring that lease into production.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'd say it's similar to the renewables. Renewables run on a different timeline. There is a negotiated initial lease with us, and in the case of solar, we have a 5-year type development period where they're working on getting their permitting in place, getting their interconnection agreements in place, and working out power purchase agreements similar to the ones that were announced at the groundbreakings we had last week or the week before with Park City, Salt Lake City, for the Electron project that we have under construction. So there's a 5, and then they move into an operation term of 30 years typically.
Alyssa, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Troy and Wes, it's great to meet you. My name is Alyssa Kim, the Director of the State Energy Program here in the Office of Energy Development. And I'm fairly new to the office, so just kind of making connections with everyone. And I'm curious about the Forge project. And I'm wondering if there's somebody that I can talk to more about that.
Sure, we're probably running out of time now, but I'd be the one to reach out to that. And we actually have Tyler on Wes's staff, who is very familiar with it as our geoscientist on staff. So
great.
Get him on board and we can talk about that some more.
Wonderful. I'll reach out. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, you were right, Troy. We are at 12:45, which is the time that we had scheduled for this lunch and learn. Antonio in our office also wanted to know if there are any open projects for renewables, but maybe I will have him, unless you have a short answer, maybe I'll have him reach out to you offline so we can.
Yeah, I was just going to say offline might be best. Both Wes's and my contact information is on the Trust website. As we said, it's trustlands.utah.gov. You can reach out to either of us. That's part of our jobs, is to try and get properties and the Trust portfolio into being developed. And so that's what we'd like to see. So both for renewables and for oil and gas industry.
Okay, well, that was a lot of great information. Thank you, Wes and Troy, for taking time out of your busy days to give us an overview of what you guys do at SITLA. Thanks to everybody who attended and eating your lunch with us. And we all look forward to our next Lunch and Learn, which will be at 1 p.m. on December 1st, if you can even believe that we're already to December practically. So
It is hard to believe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a nice day,
Thank you.
everybody. Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.